I wanted to try something a little bit different today. I've received this question so many times about professional level of play. Why is Reinhardt never played in professional play, even when the Brawl meta seems perfect for him? Reaper, Mei, Avenger, all these characters, Lucio, Speed Boost. Why is it always Ramattra, Orisa, Malga, and sometimes even Zarya, but never Rein? I mean, Rein was historically always the king of Brawl, at least in Overwatch 1, and yes, partly due to the 5v5 format, he struggled with that, but also partly due to the new hero design that many of these new tanks have come out with, and it's just a huge problem if you're a Rein player. Now, the good news is that I do think that Rein is very operational and ranked. I think he's fine to play. He can be frustrating at times, and many of the things that he can do that those tanks can't is part of the reason why he's so good at ranked. We'll get into that one later. But at least at the professional level, when you're playing a Brawl composition, you're not going to be playing Reinhardt almost ever unless you're a specialist, and even then, he's generally not optimal. The question is, why is that the case? We'll get into that. But first off, what is Brawl composition? And I think we need to establish this before we get into our first couple of points about Rein, why Rein is not being played. So a Brawl composition is essentially a composition that's styled on the ability to push and pull. If you think about Overwatch, a lot of Overwatch is about taking off angles and splitting and attention and taking positions and flanks and so on. But Brawl compositions, while they do take those angles, they take less or fewer of those angles, and those angles tend to be a little bit closer to the team. And there's a very important reason why that's the case. The most obvious reason is that you're playing shorter range characters, so the need to take deeper flanks is generally not as often needed. But the other reason is that these characters often have AoE abilities. You have characters like Baptiste, Lucio, Mei, Malga, Ramattra, even just shields as a whole. A lot of these have AoE abilities that benefit with people around them or enemies that are grouped up. And so while you will consistently have people taking off angles, usually a DPS or support, sometimes even a support with a DPS and Brawl mirrors, they're just not generally split quite as far as they are in playing a more range comp or a more divey comp. In Overwatch 2, comps tend to be a lot more hybrid, so keep that in mind. So when I say the word Brawl, I'm generally just talking about a short-range tank with a speed boost, whether that's Juno or Lucio. And we've seen every single time that these Brawl comps become meta, it's usually a Ramattra, Malga, or Orisa being played and not Reinhardt. Now, to understand why that's the case, we need to understand a very important concept of what I mentioned earlier, push-pull, and why it's really bad for Rein. So when we talk about push-pull, the nice thing about being more grouped up while still taking conservative off angles is that it's simply easier to push and pull advantages. To push the advantage is to simply say that our Mei wall was better, or we didn't mess up and use our cooldown, so we can push our advantage and just turn our cooldown advantage into kills or space. Or, oh no, we messed up our cooldowns. We're going to prevent you from turning your cooldown advantage into kills. We'll give you the space, but we're not going to let you take the advantage and turn it into a team fight win. If you get a bad Mei wall, well, you can just speed boost out or disengage. If you get a good Mei wall, well, you can speed boost in. If you have an ultimate to push with, like Dragon Blade or Blizzard, you can push in, or Cage Fight. Or if they're using an ultimate on you, like Kitsune Rush, you can speed boost and disengage it entirely. And that's the very essence of what a lot of these Brawl compositions have. Now, other comps can kite out disengage ultimates or push in ultimates, but you see it a lot rarer because those compositions don't necessarily have as much mobility, or they don't have the speed boost. So when you talk about the importance of push-pull at the professional level, the ability to push with your ultimates, push with your cooldowns, or kite their cooldowns, kite their ultimates, Reinhardt doesn't get played because Reinhardt doesn't have the capability to kite things for free. I'm actually on the wrong scene here. Reinhardt has to actually pin in to push an advantage, but there's inherent risk out of pin. Reinhardt has to actually pin out if he wants to kite a disadvantage or walk slowly backwards with shield, which eventually is a resource and will eventually break. Reinhardt can push advantages, but it's a much higher risk. Reinhardt can kite disadvantages, but again, at a much higher risk. Reinhardt is a relatively tanky character, and he has a lot of flexibility of what he can do, but a lot of the dynamics that he brings to the table in terms of his lateral mobility is just not as useful in a Brawl mirror. Now, I want you to compare that to a character like Malga. Malga can easily push with his pin because guess what? His pin also provides CC immunity and damage immunity that Reinhardt doesn't. Malga also has a burst of extreme mitigation with his cardiac overdrive, something that Reinhardt does not necessarily have. Now, you can argue that shield is similar to that, but you can't multitask, which is something that Malga can do. We'll talk more about that one in just a moment. But overall, if Malga also has a disadvantage, he can also just run away. And again, there's a lot more safety doing this with Malga than there is with any other characters. And it's not just Malga. Orisa can push with her Javelin Spin. Orisa can kite with her Javelin Spin. Orisa can push with her Fortify, especially now that the slow has been mostly removed, which is not a bad thing. Something we'll make a video about that some other time. And if you push her, she has a bad cooldown trade. Well, she can just Fortify her Javelin Spin out. And all of doing this while multitasking, applying offensive pressure while also being extra offensive or kiting. Ramatra's the real killer here. Not only does he the mitigation of his shield, but he also has the ability to push advantages with speed boost with Nemesis while also blocking as necessary. Oh, and things are not going well? And unlike shield, this is the equivalent of an infinite resource. It's really only on a timer. And at the highest level, a 1600 shield is not going to be as good of a source of a mitigation as a block. And oh, you can refresh this with your ultimate. Oh, and that's my next point. All of these characters have ultimates that essentially refresh their mitigation or provide new sources of mitigation. Nemesis with, well, Annihilation with Nemesis, rather. Fortify, you get more Fortify when you're pressing your ultimate with Orisa. And Malga gets his own freaking cage, right? So there's just infinite ways of being able to apply mitigation, sustain mitigation, and then also not necessarily being a high maintenance tank necessarily. You see, when you're playing a Brawl mirror, Malga can keep himself up a great deal. Obviously, if you're playing Malga into poke heroes, you're going to struggle, but pros are not going to be playing Malga into poke heroes. And so Malga can keep himself up, especially when he has Cardiac. Or Ramatra can keep himself up, especially when he has Nemesis. So you have these characters that don't require babysitting also when they're putting on offensive pressure. Whereas Reinhardt doesn't need babysitting, but he doesn't need babysitting when he's shielding. If he's swinging, he's going to be taking damage, is going to demand support. And this makes him a little bit more higher resource. And in addition to that, when you talk about ultimates, whereas Earthshatter is a pretty good ultimate even at the highest level, it's not something that provides Reinhardt mitigation. So a mistake, well, it's a mistake, and you're probably going to die for it, and that's just something that a lot of the other tanks don't have. You see, this is the key thing here. It's not that Reinhardt is the hardest tank to pick up. I would argue in many ways that Ramatra is a more difficult tank at its skill floor. I think Reinhardt can get a lot of value in low ranks just by holding shield. But the highest level, the ability to cover your mistakes, the ability to kite out or push or disengage ultimates is just so much easier. And that's something that is just inherently built into the Brawl composition mindset, the ability to push and pull to be able to do it safely. Reinhardt can do it, but it's a lot more mechanically difficult. You need to hit your fire strikes. You need to be able to block key cooldowns. And Ramatra, Malga, Orisa just have free mitigation, and that's something that's been inherent to a lot of the Overwatch 2 new tank design. And I think that's a big mistake. That's why characters like Jungle Queen haven't been played, even though she has a great deal of pushing and pulling, but she just doesn't have that free mitigation. It's skill-based mitigation, and that ceiling is just incredibly difficult to really reach, at least consistently. So the question here is, what does it actually look like in the pro play? And I'm not going to give you guys a couple examples of this. I just pulled a couple of random VODs. I actually didn't even pick these out, but this is, I think, going to prove my point. The fact that I don't even necessarily need to find specific timestamps. I don't even need to prepare. You're just going to see push and pull immediately. So we're on Malga here. This is Malga versus Sigma. We see an advantage. We're looking to close the distance on the Sigma. And I assume at some point he's just going to run in. Yeah, see, there's the accretion there, right? By the way, that accretion can't even stop the run. So even if he had accretion right now, it wouldn't stop the Malga. Malga would be able to push in for free. They close the distance basically at will. They kite it out. Nice job, Toronto Defiant. Great job. And then we're just going to close the distance again. There's nothing they can do about that. And then you pop Cardiac when needed, and you're basically invulnerable now as everybody else around you. And it's just something that's unique to Malga and a lot of these other tanks because they just have the capability of pushing advantages and kiting disadvantages essentially at will. I did have this one timestamp because we had to skip some Diva play, but this is another good example here. So we got a Ramatra mirror. They get a great May wall. We Vortex, we shield, we hold Nemesis, and nothing. Like, he doesn't even really take any significant damage. So it's just like, oh, can I take a little bit less damage than the enemy Ramatra? Okay, now we're going to win the fight off of that. But it's not a very satisfying form of skill expression here. This one, he actually pushes up just a little bit too far before he gets Nemesis, and that's the only reason he dies. Otherwise, he just would have held block and held block again. And I think next fight is a good representation here as well, where they're going to push, they're going to use an ultimate, the enemy Ram just holds block and holds block and holds block and holds block. Imagine a 6,000 HP shield. That's kind of what we got here. There's another ultimate. There's 3 ultimates being used here. 1, 2, 3 ultimates, and finally Hanbin dies. And that's Ramatra, ladies and gentlemen. A relatively skill-based character, but not necessarily the most interesting one to watch because of that free mitigation. And nowadays, we're actually watching a lot of pro play, at least at the time this video is being recorded. And a lot of what's being happening here is, this is post-Orisa buff, where Orisa has the capability of kind of pushing advantages if she sees to, right? So she's able to, oh, that's a crazy Maywell. Wow, incredible. If you see an advantage, you can push it with your Javelin Spin. Oh no, we have a disadvantage. I'm going to Javelin Spin out. And then I think there's a point in time. Let's see if we can find a point in time here where there's a push here. Yeah, so they're looking for a rotation on backline here. And just like, look at how Orisa is able to secure this. I guess Javelin itself is also pretty useful at securing because it slows people from being able to kite away from you. And so much of this is just like look at the uptime out of this. We're going to have mitigation from the ultimate, and then we're going to have mitigation from the fortify afterwards. And it just essentially allows Orisa to move at will. And Orisa hasn't been healed since like 1934, and it doesn't really matter all that much. And it only eventually dies because she eventually runs out of CDs. It's not that this is what makes Orisa unbelievably broken. And I'm not complaining necessarily that these all characters are skillless and Overwatch sucks. I do have issues with these character designs, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's not because they're skillless necessarily. It's just that so much of their value is front-loaded in a specific niche, such that when it's supported in the way that it is in these compositions, they just outperform every other tank. And the problem is it's also not particularly visually interesting. I think characters like these have their moments. Javelin can be fun, Ramattra Nemesis form can be fun, but the gameplay loops are just fundamentally flawed, and it's not so much that they're beating Reinhardt, and that's a crime. It's the fact that they're beating Reinhardt in a such much less interesting way from a game health standpoint. Whereas if you compare something like this, it took me a while to find some Reinhardt gameplay. Shout out to OBS Sojourner for these great POVs, right? Like, that's a reasonable pin, but he misses the pin, and guess what? Even with shield, he's going to die for that, right? His shield's broken. He's taking the resources. And I think like that's something that we don't see reflected too often in a lot of other characters' gameplay. So the question is why is Reinhardt still being played in ranked? And honestly, sometimes even occasionally in pro play, like we've seen these weird situations. And if I of all people should know this because I coached Reinhardt into the non-brawl mirrors, and so we talked a great deal about it. But when we talked about playing Reinhardt, it was never in a brawl matchup, almost ever, back in Overwatch League Season 5, the second season of Overwatch 2, or the first season of Overwatch 2. And the thing that Reinhardt brings to the table these other brawl tanks don't is the ability to kind of hold poke attention for a long period of time. You see, the problem with Orisa and Ramattra is they can maintain a lot of threat, but they have a hard time holding threat from long distances. They don't have the mobility of Pen. And even a character like Malga, while he can technically do this kind of like Rein, once he gets there, if he's not actively shooting something, he's dying. Reinhardt can pin to any off angle, any flank, any backline, and kind of hold shield and maintain pressure for a long period of time. And he can also block CC or CDs, other characters that cannot do that, at least not as consistently. And so in ranked, you're going to see a lot more poke characters. You're going to see a lot more hybrid weird characters. You're not going to see the old brawl matchups with Lucio and so on. And so the ability to push and pull is less useful, but the ability to control lateral space and to be able to be dynamic versus many other DPS and supports is extremely valuable. The ability to control the space at significant distance is a huge advantage in ranked. In the Overwatch League, we played Rein, as I mentioned earlier, versus a lot of dive and poke compositions, and we honestly used Rein like a mobile wall or a push button, just kind of controlling different angles. But we didn't really necessarily group up and push together. And I think that's what Rein brings to the table and why he's still relatively effective in ranked. You guys have all seen, or you should have seen, LH Cloudy played Rein. And the creative ways that he makes space with Rein is something that is really not replicable with Malga, Orisa, or Ramattra. And honestly, guys, that's a crime for those tanks. It's not just about what makes those tanks better than Rein in all the wrong circumstances, but what makes them worse than Rein in all the wrong circumstances. They're all pretty myopic and one-dimensional tanks, and so it's rough. So what to do? It's tricky. I think from the perspective of defending Rein players here, I think the biggest thing is the environment around Rein in the tank class needs to change, not necessarily Rein himself. Maybe fire strike damage needs to get better, maybe more frontline pressure, but I honestly feel like in many ways, it's actually like less changes or fewer changes for Rein and more changes around Malga, Ramattra, and Orisa. I think Rein, Winston, Sigma are great characters that have measurable counterplay while still having dynamics. That should be the norm for tank design, even in the 5v5 format. Slabs of meat, brainless mitigation, isn't fun to play. This is why these tanks, Ramattra, Malga, Orisa, are constantly underpicked even when they're strong. Even though a lot of their skill floors, especially with characters like Malga and Orisa, are relatively easy to access, people just don't want to play them. There's people that got boosted with Malga back in Season 8 because there were so many tanks that, despite him being oppressive, just refused and could not stomach playing him. Tanks need skillful counterplay. And I'm sorry, mistakes do occasionally deserve to be punished with your life, not just a bad cooldown trade from your backline. In addition, I think this also echoes the tank ultimate design. More Earth Shatters, please. I think tank ult design, as of recently, has been pretty poor. I think we need a lot more creativity. A huge cage, a huge Ramatra, more Nemesis form, a Whirlwind that fortifies you again. I think some of them are visually interesting, but ultimately don't really add a lot of interesting dynamics in terms of gameplay design. And I think that that's something that is really a crime, because it just continues to emphasize the mistakes that were made with the Tank's original kit. So that's why Rein's not being played. He can't push, he can't pull as easily. There's a lot more risk for the reward. And a lot of the things that Rein does bring to the table in terms of off-angle control, being able to block CC and CDs, it's just not as applicable in the style of compositions that are being played. And I think that's a shame. And I hope that we see in future tank design, and honestly even reworks of the Brawl tanks that we have right now, a capability to give those tanks more dynamics, more counterplay that is revolved around skillful mitigation and not brain-dead mitigation. It is a huge crime that Nemesis Form Block, Malga's Cardiac Overdrive and Self-Heal, and Orisa's Fortify, without even being able to be headshot, are all things that are involved in the tank design. Because even when those tanks are weak, they're just not that interesting to play or watch. Hope that makes sense. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Obviously, this is not just a commentary on professional meta and explanation of professional meta, but also kind of a commentary and a criticism of the current Overwatch 2 tank design beyond Junker Queen, who is phenomenal, my sweet, sweet summer child. And yeah, that is all I got. Let me know what you guys think.